A mechanic, smoke piercing the night, and an unexpected encounter. Colt faced a life-changing decision. But that night, not only a life but a deeper secret would be revealed. What happened and how did it change Colt's life? The answers will surprise you. Colt gazed up at the old wooden sign above his small garage, Colt's Garage. It was a simple, modest shop on the town's only main street. The familiar scent of oil and metal wafted from inside. After spending so many years in the big city, this place felt like a sanctuary, though it carried its own weight. The debts, the moving costs, and the constant worry of making ends meet often kept Colt awake at night. After his divorce, he had wanted to escape. The noise and chaos of the city had become unbearable. Here in the quiet town, time seemed to flow slower. Waking up to the sound of birds and the earthy scent of fields was a welcome change from the suffocating concrete jungle. Yet, the challenges of life still followed him. Determined to do his best, Colt had promised himself he would make it work. His little garage was a daily battle, but over time the townsfolk began to notice his skill and integrity. What started with 1 or 2 customers soon grew into a steady stream of business. People came not only to have their cars repaired but also because they found comfort in Colt's quiet, dependable nature. When Colt first arrived in town, he rented a small apartment, but he quickly realized it would strain his budget. So, he decided to move into the tiny room behind his garage. Though cramped and uncomfortable, it made sense to stay there until things improved. By cutting his living expenses, he could pay off his debts on time and even save a little. As usual, he woke up early, got dressed, and prepared for the day. He made himself a coffee on the small stovetop, grabbed some milk from the mini fridge, and had a simple breakfast of cereal. Then he unlocked the garage door and got to work, performing final checks on a car due for delivery that day. The day passed quickly, and by late afternoon, an elderly woman appeared at the garage door holding a food container. Colt greeted her as she stepped inside. Smiling warmly, the woman said, "Hello, welcome to the neighborhood. My name's Ruth. I live in the little house just behind the garage. We're practically neighbors." Colt smiled back, introducing himself, and pulled up a chair for her. Ruth looked around, her eyes filled with curiosity. "I've noticed the garage lights are on late into the night. Do you forget to turn them off?" she asked. Colt hesitated, unsure how to respond. His face tensed briefly before he replied somewhat sheepishly, "Oh yeah, I guess I forget sometimes." Ruth, however, seemed to understand the truth behind his words. Without pressing further, she offered the container, saying, "Some friends mentioned you're living alone and working long hours, so I brought you some of the stew I made." Colt accepted the gesture with genuine gratitude. As Ruth stood to leave, she said, "Winter's coming. It snows heavily around here, so be prepared, all right?" Colt nodded, "I will, thank you." Ruth added, "If you ever need anything, my house is the one with the porch out front. You know where to find me." Colt thanked her again, and Ruth left with a gentle wave. Colt sat down and slowly began eating the warm meal Ruth had brought. Each bite seemed to warm not just his body but his spirit as well. That small act of kindness eased his loneliness, bringing him a quiet comfort he hadn't realized he needed. Colt closed up his garage and retreated to his small room. The cold was becoming more noticeable with each passing day. He turned on his electric heater, and once the room had warmed up a bit, he stretched out on the worn sofa and pulled a blanket over himself. Despite the warmth, sleep eluded him. His thoughts drifted to how harsh the winter would be here. As if the weight of his debts and financial worries weren't enough, he now had to contend with the freezing temperatures. An idea struck him. What if I installed a vent and used a wood stove in the back of the shop? He glanced at the wall, wondering if it was feasible. The thought lingered in his mind until he could no longer resist. He got up, slipped on his boots, and stepped outside to inspect the back wall. The cold air hit his face as he examined the wall. It seemed sturdy, and Colt figured he could find a suitable spot for a stovepipe. Yet he hesitated. If I do this, people might figure out I'm living here because of the smoke, he thought. The last thing he wanted was for anyone to pity him, so he decided to put the idea on hold. "Not now," he muttered, turning away toward the row of small houses behind the garage. Ruth's house stood among the others, her porch visible from the shop, though it wasn't exactly close. Just as he was about to head back inside, something caught his eye. Thin wisps of smoke were rising from her house, but they weren't coming from a chimney or stovepipe. Instead, the smoke dispersed unevenly, as if something was burning where it shouldn't be. Colt frowned, his gaze fixed on the strange sight. The unsettling nature of the smoke stirred an uneasy feeling in his chest. Could there be a problem? He wondered, his mind racing through the possibilities. He stood still for a moment, the weight of concern growing as he debated whether to act. Colt was almost certain there was a fire after just a few seconds of observation. Without hesitation he started running. The snow-covered ground was pure white, and a light snowfall drifted down from the sky. Colt, breathing heavily, reached the house's porch. He tried the door but found it locked. Without wasting time he headed to the back where smoke was rising. The smell of smoke grew stronger but no flames were visible yet. Colt approached one of the back windows to check inside. Flames from the stove had spread to the curtains, and smoke filled every corner of the room. Ruth sat motionless in her chair, her knitting resting in her lap. Her face was pale and it was clear she wasn't breathing. She must have fainted. Colt moved to the back door but it was locked. Searching the yard he found a large pair of garden shears. He had to break the glass. Removing his sweater, he wrapped it around his hand, gripped the shears tightly and shattered the window with one blow. As glass shards fell, he carefully reached inside and unlocked the door. The moment Colt entered, smoke filled his lungs. He pulled his sweater over his mouth and nose to keep from coughing. The smoke was thick and suffocating but he needed to reach Ruth. He hurried to her side. Trying to rouse her, Colt saw her eyelids flutter open briefly before closing again. She was clearly deprived of oxygen. He immediately lifted her into his arms and rushed outside. Colt laid Ruth down on the snow, ensuring she could breathe fresh air. She began coughing but her breathing was still irregular. Colt shouted for help. Help! Somebody help! The door of a house across the street opened, and an elderly man in pajamas stepped out, holding a phone and calling 911. Colt entrusted Ruth to him and turned back toward the house. Colt thought there might be a fire extinguisher in the shed. Steadying his breath, he checked under the stairs and found a rusty extinguisher. Removing the safety pin, he took a deep breath and went back inside. By now, the flames had spread to the corners of the room. The curtains were completely burned, and the fire had caught the wooden floors and walls. Colt pulled his sweater over his face again, aimed the extinguisher at the flames, and sprayed foam with all his might. The fire was largely under control, but the thick smoke nearly caused Colt to pass out. His eyes burned and he struggled to breathe. With a final effort, he extinguished the remaining flames. Staggering toward the door, he stumbled outside and collapsed onto the snow. Colt gasped for air, trying to clear his lungs. His eyes were red, and his body trembled with exhaustion. Meanwhile, Ruth lay nearby, still weak but breathing more steadily. In the distance, the flashing lights of an ambulance and fire trucks appeared. The fire truck and ambulance arrived at the scene simultaneously. Emergency responders immediately tended to Ruth and Colt, fitting both with oxygen masks. Ruth struggled to regain consciousness. Her lungs had been exposed to smoke for too long. Colt, on the other hand, recovered more quickly, though he was still feeling the effects of exhaustion and irritated eyes from the smoke. While Colt was being checked over in the ambulance, the firefighters conducted a thorough inspection of the house. Once they confirmed the fire was fully extinguished, one of the team members approached the ambulance with a report in hand. "The fire started from the stove and caught the curtains," he said, glancing at the report. The house's wooden walls were coated with fire-resistant varnish, but that protection had weakened over time. The entire house could have gone up in flames. "You intervened just in time," he added, nodding at Colt with appreciation. The medical team decided that Ruth needed to be kept under observation at the hospital. Colt didn't want to leave her alone, so he accompanied her in the ambulance. When they arrived at the hospital, the doctors performed a thorough examination on Ruth. Although her condition wasn't critical, her prolonged exposure to low levels of smoke would require some time to recover. Thankfully, all necessary treatments had been administered, and the doctors were confident she would make a full recovery. At the hospital reception, the staff asked Colt if he knew Ruth's relatives. When Colt said he didn't, they checked the system for emergency contacts and managed to reach Ruth's son. While the receptionist informed him of the situation, Colt stayed by Ruth's side. After a long and grueling night, Colt finally returned to his workshop. Exhausted but somewhat relieved, he prepared a warm cup of coffee, sat by the window in his small room, and silently prayed for Ruth's swift recovery. Colt spent that day resting, following the doctor's advice. However, before long, his own worries began creeping into his mind: debts, the future of the shop, and a lingering sense of loneliness. As he struggled to push those thoughts aside, he heard a knock on the repair shop's door. He quickly stepped outside and found a man standing there. The man's eyes glimmered with gratitude. "Hello," he said in a shaky voice. "I'm Ruth's son. I can't thank you enough. My mother." His voice broke as he suddenly burst into tears. Colt ushered him inside and sat him down on a chair. Taking a deep breath, the man began speaking. "My name is Mark," he said. "My mother's getting old. After I got married and my father passed away, she's been living alone. No matter how much I insisted, she wouldn't agree to move in with me. And now, she could have died in that fire. When I got the news, I was terrified." Mark's voice trembled, the emotional weight of the situation making it hard for him to speak. Colt placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Your mom's okay. She'll get even better," he said. Mark let out a deep sigh and continued, "It's all thanks to you, my friend. If it weren't for you, most of the people in these homes are elderly, they'd all be asleep at that hour. No one would have noticed until the entire house was in flames. God, this shop has been empty for years. You haven't been here long either. If it weren't for you." Tears filled Mark's eyes again, his gratitude difficult to put into words. "How's your mom doing? Is she still in the hospital?" Colt asked. Mark shook his head. "No, she's resting at home. I don't want to leave her here alone." Colt nodded understandingly. "If she's up for it, I'd like to stop by and wish her well," he said. Mark agreed and they set off together for Ruth's house. Ruth's face lit up when she saw Colt. She thanked him deeply, her voice filled with emotion. "You know," she said with a tired but wise expression, "some things aren't just coincidences." Her words made Colt pause and thought. Ruth continued, "It's strange, isn't it? The day we met, the fire broke out." Colt hesitated for a moment. If he hadn't stepped outside to check the wall, he wouldn't have noticed the fire. And if he hadn't been forced to sleep in his shop, he wouldn't have even been there that night. The chain of events seemed to carry meaning. Colt's eyes welled up, but he felt at peace seeing Ruth recovering. "You're okay now," he told her. Ruth smiled softly. "Thanks to you," she replied, once again expressing her gratitude. Turning to her son, Ruth spoke gently. "You're right. I won't scare you like that again. I'll come with you." Mark was overjoyed, hardly believing what he was hearing. "Mom, you need to be with me now. I don't want to see you alone anymore," he said. Ruth glanced at Colt and added, "But on one condition. Only if Colt accepts this house." Colt stared at her in shock. Ruth continued, "You saved my life. I should have left this house a long time ago. For me, this town has been nothing but loneliness and sorrow. Now I want to do the right thing. I know you need a place to stay. You can live here as long as you like. Please accept it." Mark nodded in agreement. "My mom is alive because of you. The insurance will cover the damage to the house. Stay here, it's close to your shop." Colt was overwhelmed by what he was hearing. Tears streamed down his face, but a warm feeling of gratitude and peace filled his heart. At first, Colt said the offer was too much. "I'm truly grateful, but I can't accept something so big," he said with a hint of embarrassment. Ruth looked at him with a calm smile. "Colt," she said in a gentle but firm voice, "I have no intention of selling this house. I'm going to live with my son, and the house will sit here empty. Why let it go unused when you need it? Please accept this as a kindness." Colt took a deep breath at her words. He thought about how much this offer could change his situation. With heartfelt gratitude he finally said, "All right, I accept. I'll never forget your kindness." That night, when Colt returned to the repair shop, he gazed out the window at Ruth's house. This house would now be his new starting point. He reflected on how unexpectedly life had shifted. The town where he had arrived filled with loneliness and struggles had given him a home and new friends. For the first time in a long while, Colt fell asleep in peace. He welcomed the new day thinking of his reshaped life and the gratitude he owed Ruth. Life might be challenging, but every hardship brought with it the seeds of new hope. Some stories are not just endings but also new beginnings. If this story moved you and you're eager for more emotional journeys, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Be sure to check out our other videos for more inspiration. See you in the next story.